You've been talking about these issues for a long time, and I'm curious if you found the recent research that was leaked to the Wall Street Journal bombshell and what you find most alarming about these new revelations.
Yeah, well, in other news, water is wet, right? I mean, this is essentially, we know now the obvious, which is that this business model of monetizing attention is connected to, just like, war is good for GDP. There's things we don't like in society that are really profitable. Suicidal ideation in teenage girls is good for engagement for Facebook and for Instagram. Alienation and body image dysmorphia issues is good for Instagram and good for engagement. There's evidence in the Facebook files that making political parties more negative and divisive has been good for Facebook. In fact, specifically in the Facebook files, there was a change they made in 2018 to the algorithm. And that change caused political parties in Poland and Spain and all sorts of places to actually go 80% more negative and divisive and to basically only get traffic. That shows that these companies have an unparalleled amount of power. Now, with respect to the hearings yesterday, I think everyone's just frustrated because we already knew this, and they're acting like a tobacco company. This is what I think you asked if this is a bombshell. This is a bombshell in that it puts a nail in the coffin on the story, on any doubt that they knew the harms that they were causing, and they continued to prioritize engagement anyway. Now, as you and I both noted, the stock price hasn't moved. Does that mean that investors don't care? Or does that mean that the business model of having a network effect on monopolizing the means of communication? So if you're a teenage girl, I mean, Emily, you and I, we probably use iMessage or text messaging on our iPhones to communicate with each other. But for many teenagers, Instagram messaging is the #1 way that you communicate with your friends. So if you don't use Instagram, you are ostracized and excluded from your community. And they know this, by the way. They design to lock you in. And this is the problem, is that we have something that has taken hostage our country, our teenagers' mental health, and our democracy. And we know that it's bad for us. And even then, the stock price doesn't move. But I'm optimistic because I do think this is the moment to make a transformational change to the business model of these companies. And I think there's a way that can happen. And I hope that happens. I think the whistleblower is going to be testifying next week in front of Congress.
We are going to be following that whistleblower's testimony on Tuesday. Tristan, we often hear the argument, well, kids are online anyway, so we have to figure out how to manage that experience. How do you respond to that? And can we trust Facebook to be the one to shape and build that experience? And if not, who should?
It's a great question. The reason why, the challenge obviously is it's a race for attention. So Instagram says, if I don't do it, I know that TikTok's going to do it. They're going to do the body image filters and the engagement machine. And that's why we call it the race to the bottom of the brainstem. I do think we have to have standards. When I was growing up, we had something called Saturday morning cartoons, and there was time, manner, place restrictions. We had actually child psychologists define what was good for children during those operating hours. And in an unregulated environment, it's just a race to manipulate your kids. And how could we allow this to happen? I do think Apple has a role in because they control the App Store. They're almost like the constitutional sort of central bank of attention, and they can define the terms by which things can interact with children. I also do think we obviously need standards for these companies. I don't blame one company. I see it not as the Facebook files, but as the social media files. And so long as the business model is lifetime, value of a user and addiction is very good for their business and stretching earlier and earlier and earlier into a child's development. So that's fundamentally incompatible, I think, with our society.
So who then is responsible for regulating that experience? Should it be Congress? Take a listen to this from Adam Kovacevic, who was a longtime former Google executive, but now spends his time lobbying in Washington. He wanted to hear more from these hearings, not just penalizing Facebook. Take a listen.
What I hear is parents, grappling with a lot of these questions about screen time, bullying, jealousy, and kids are going through their adolescence online, the good, the bad, the ugly. It would be great to see Congress work together with industry to devise some solutions, because I think that's what parents want, but that's not really what we saw today.
So should Congress have this responsibility, and will they actually make it happen?
I think we're at a fundamental crossroads because the private sector has eaten up the public interest, whether it's democratic elections or media. We don't have governments that can define those things anymore. We have technology companies that are defining those things. I do think we need to have, obviously, expert bodies that can actually work out these issues. There is such a way to design technology humanely, though. You don't have to design for maximizing the ability for one person to reach as many people as possible, especially in youth and in the young kids. And I think that decision to say, when you post something as a 13-year-old, it's visible to as many people as possible. That's because that was good for engagement. That's what creates the bullying dynamics from afar. And that's what creates the social visibility to be shamed in public. And that creates the social pressure and social anxiety. But the whole design needs to change. It's not the advertising, it's the whole design model. We don't have to have children that are basically broadcasting their lives from this early. And one thing we know from the Facebook documents, they actually had a slide, I think, called the play date as a growth lever, where they actually said, how do we use the play date to get kids hooked into basically feeling comparison with other kids and to start getting into the sharing treadmill earlier in their lives? We don't have to have that kind of social media. We can have Khan Academy. We can have YouTube that's all about learning. China, as an example, has actually recently created a youth mode. They forcibly required TikTok. For under the age of 14, they limit usage, and they create museum and science experiments you can do at home, museum exhibits. They put all this stuff into the newsfeed more for an educational experience. And that's because they see this as a threat. I'm not saying we should do what China's doing, but we need an open society answer that recognizes that we have to do something.
Speaking of China, take a listen to this from Senator Sullivan about China and how that played out yesterday.
Can you really, on your own, help people take a break, or do we, the U.S. government, have to help people take a break like the Chinese are doing right now?
As a parent, I'd much prefer to be able to determine my child's time online than to have China tell me how to raise my child.
Tristan, does China have something right here or not?
I think like I said, I'm not saying we should do what China's doing, but we need an open society answer. Here's the current state of affairs. Right now, it's unregulated, basically a supercomputer pointed at your kid's brain to basically stall the development of children's brains, to basically say, my job is to overwhelm your self-control, because literally the way TikTok and Instagram work is they have $1 trillion of compute power to figure out what's the next video that's going to keep you scrolling, as opposed to giving you a stopping cue that allows you to get up and take a break. In Sesame Street, Elmo gets up and says, hey, do you want to do a little dance? And so he gets the kids up to do a dance. Once the kids are up, now they can actually do something else. Sesame Street would do that because their business model is not screwing up kids and monetizing their attention. But so long as, again, Instagram and TikTok are, we have to have something like that. I do think we need some standards. We had to develop things like the 5 seconds of black, between TV shows. We had to develop things like the Elmo concept in Sesame Street. I think these kinds of things can exist, but we actually have to have them in an open society way, not the authoritarian model that China's doing.
These things are going to take time, and as a parent, I've got 4 children. Every parent is asking themselves this question: how do I gatekeep technology for my child right now? I remember you recommending to adults a digital Sabbath, taking a day off from your devices. What do we do for our children right now when these tools and products aren't necessarily available yet?
I think that oftentimes when we talk about addiction or what kids should do, it feels like we have to sort of tie our hands behind our back and not use it. It's a restraint-driven approach. But the reason that we're so vulnerable to what we call a hyper-normal stimuli, which is a sort of dopamine, extra sugar, extra salt, extra dopamine kind of social media world, is because we live in a hypo-normal, meaning a under-stimulating and under-fulfilling environment. When you don't have social connection or oxytocin or touch or love or just conversation in your life that feels fulfilling, that's what makes us vulnerable. If you were out there doing acro yoga with your friends or sewing or having a really engaging conversation with people you love or something you're really passionate about or dancing, those are the things that actually make us less vulnerable. We don't want to check our phones when we're doing those things. But what we need is technology that steers us in the direction of what lifts up us into a more fulfilling environment so that we don't feel so compelled by these hypernormal stimuli. That's actually the way out. Obviously, to do that, we need to have a collaboration with tech that's not about predating on the vulnerabilities of our children.
So do you think Facebook should be not involved in developing these tools at all? Like, should Facebook stop Instagram for kids entirely? Should we be, looking to Sesame Street to build these products?
I honestly think that the entire thing, TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, are all bad for children. And if I were recommended, I'd say that they shouldn't use them at all. The problem, of course, is that it's not an individual decision for one kid or one parent to make, because again, they have lock-in effects and you'll be ostracized from your community, which again, they do deliberately because they know that's what keeps their users. I do think that Apple has a role in trying to make safer standards, Apple and Google, and setting the standards of the app stores. And hopefully this pressure could lead to some of that to happen because they're above the competition. As you said, if Facebook doesn't build Instagram for kids, that doesn't stop the problem. All the kids are still right there on Instagram anyway, using it. I really do think that all these things are horrible for children, and I would recommend that most parents, if they're looking for just advice, to avoid it as much as they can.
So do we take the iPads away from our kids right now until there are better options, or what?
Well, no, keep in mind the distinction I'm saying here, which is it's not about the technology. It's not this piece of metal. It's not that the rectangle or the glowing rectangle is the evil thing we should feel worried about touching. It's about what is on there. Are the interests of the people designing the technology the same as your interests? I mean, I've studied the Sesame Street history. They had child psychologists who cared about what is the developmental level of children and what's appropriate for that developmental level. And they did that by using all the things we know about television, but then combining it with what would be a fiduciary value or interest to children's development. None of the people who are building this stuff now are doing it in the interest of children. That's the thing that needs to change.
Quick question, Tristan, and I know we could talk about this for days, but the next chapter is the metaverse. How do we get this right for kids and grown-ups?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's one thing when you run out of attention that people are going to look at on their screens. It's another thing to try to create an entire universe that people are going to stare at through virtual reality and augmented reality 24/7. And that's what they're really competing for. I mean, the way to grow the size of the attention economy is to get people to live in these virtual worlds as much full time as you possibly can. I think that if we don't get it right at the beginning, I worry where we're going to end up. I mean, I wish that we had these conversations so many years earlier. So many of us have been saying for 8 years that we shouldn't be allowing this engagement-driven business model that focuses on monetizing human attention, as opposed to you're the customer, you're not the product. The key line in the social dilemma is that things that treat you as the customer, not the product. That's the distinction that we need. So what if we had, for the metaverse and for augmented reality and virtual reality, there was no such thing as engagement-driven business models? Would you want a brain implant in your brain, a neurosurgeon installs a brain implant, and the business model of that brain implant was to get you to think certain thoughts constantly, and they wanted you to use it constantly? We would never allow that kind of brain implant.